It's day 2 of a long weekend alone in your own apartment. Nobody's texted, nobody's stopped by. The silence, which felt like relief on Friday night, has started to feel like something else entirely by Sunday morning. Heavier, thicker, harder to sit inside comfortably. You catch yourself talking to the refrigerator just to hear a voice in the room. Your own voice, and something about that small, involuntary moment unsettles you more than you'd like to admit out loud to anyone. Here's the question worth actually sitting with. If 2 days of ordinary, safe, well-stocked solitude can already feel like this, what do you think would actually happen to you, physically and mentally, if you were genuinely alone for an entire week, with no phone, no walls, no guarantee that help was coming, and no idea when or if another human being would show up? Most people assume the biggest obstacle to surviving a week alone would be food, or water, or the weather. The actual research says something considerably stranger, and considerably more uncomfortable to hear. What actually breaks first, in nearly every documented case researchers have studied, isn't the body at all. Survival instructors have long taught a rough guideline, sometimes called the rule of threes, roughly 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter, in genuinely extreme conditions, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. It's a simplified teaching tool, not an exact scientific law, but it captures something real and important about the order in which your body actually starts failing you when you're left entirely on your own. Notice what's conspicuously missing from that list entirely. Other people. And yet, for a species that has spent almost its entire existence living in tight, interdependent groups, the absence of other humans turns out to be its own kind of survival variable. One the rule of threes was never actually designed to measure in the first place. Everything that follows walks through exactly why that missing variable turns out to matter so much more than most people ever expected to. Let's take the purely physical side of this seriously first, because it matters more than most people assume. Significant dehydration begins measurably affecting cognitive performance within just a few hours in hot or dry conditions, well before you'd ever described yourself as being in any real physical danger. Judgment slows, reaction time drops. Simple decisions start taking noticeably longer to make correctly. Without any dedicated shelter, exposure becomes the far more immediate threat than hunger ever is. Hypothermia can set in within just a few hours, in cold, wet, or windy conditions, long before starvation would ever become a factor worth worrying about. Food is genuinely the least urgent piece of this entire equation. A healthy adult with adequate water can typically survive several weeks without eating at all, the body gradually shifting into burning stored fat and eventually muscle tissue for fuel. Put simply, on a strictly physical level, a single ordinary week alone, assuming reasonable access to clean water and basic shelter from the elements, is well within what a healthy human body can technically endure without lasting physical harm. Which means if a week alone is going to break you, the body usually isn't going to be the reason why. Trained wilderness survival instructors will often tell you the exact same thing directly. Most healthy adults who die during a short-term survival situation weren't actually failed by their bodies at all. They had enough physical reserve to keep going considerably longer than they actually did. Something else gave out first. If the body can usually handle a week alone just fine, the mind is a considerably different story. And this is where the real research gets genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. In a now famous set of experiments run at McGill University in the 1950s, healthy volunteers were paid simply to lie still in a quiet, sensory-restricted room with nothing to do and no one to talk to. For as long as they could tolerate it, most participants, despite being paid well and facing no actual physical danger whatsoever, voluntarily quit within just a few days, reporting difficulty concentrating, mounting anxiety, and, in a striking number of cases, genuine hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that weren't actually there. Researchers studying isolated polar research station crews during long winter over periods, cut off from the outside world for months at a stretch, have documented measurable slowing in cognitive processing speed, disrupted sleep patterns, and significant mood disturbances that reliably worsen the longer the isolation continues, even among people who volunteered for the assignment and were specifically screened for psychological resilience beforehand. The unsettling pattern across all of this research is consistent. The human mind, left without any social contact whatsoever, doesn't simply feel bored or a little lonely. It starts to genuinely malfunction, in measurable, documented ways, considerably faster than most people would ever predict going in. Some of the McGill researchers later noted that several participants who initially signed up expecting an easy way to earn money for doing nothing were among the most surprised by how quickly their own minds turned on them, having assumed, reasonably enough, that simply lying quietly and thinking would be the easiest task imaginable. Here's the deeper reason the mind reacts this quickly, to isolation. For the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, being physically alone almost never happened. And, when it did happen, it was treated as a genuine emergency rather than a lifestyle choice. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have consistently found that solitary survival was essentially never a deliberate strategy anywhere in the historical or archaeological record. Humans lived in bands of roughly a few dozen to around 150 people, sharing food, sharing childcare, sharing the physical labor of staying alive, because a single person operating entirely alone in that same environment faced dramatically worse odds across nearly every category of risk at once. You couldn't watch for predators while you slept. You couldn't treat your own injuries if a task went wrong. You couldn't cover the caloric gap during a bad week of hunting with nobody else's surplus to draw on. Being separated from the group wasn't simply lonely in some abstract emotional sense. It was a direct, serious threat to your actual physical survival, on the same order as a real injury or a genuine food shortage. Your brain's intense, often disproportionate feeling reaction to isolation isn't some strange overreaction or a modern sensitivity. It's an old, extremely well-calibrated alarm, treating a currently uncommon modern circumstance exactly the way it would have needed to be treated for nearly the entire history of our species. Some anthropologists studying the few historically documented cases of individuals surviving genuinely alone for extended periods. Shipwreck survivors, isolated castaways, the rare hermit by choice, have noted a consistent theme running through nearly all of their later accounts: an overwhelming, almost desperate relief at the first sight of another human being, frequently described in terms far closer to rescue from mortal danger than simple relief from boredom. Several of these accounts specifically mention an almost physical sensation of relief the moment another voice became audible, well before any actual rescue had even begun. Search and rescue researchers who study what actually happens to people who become lost or isolated in real wilderness situations have found something that consistently surprises people outside the field. Panic and poor decision-making, not raw physical exposure, are frequently the actual determining factor in who survives and who doesn't. Documented lost person behavior shows a recurring, well-studied pattern. People who become isolated will often keep moving frantically in the wrong direction, burning through critical energy in daylight, rather than stopping to think clearly and stay in one findable place. Precisely because isolation itself measurably degrades the same calm, rational decision-making you desperately need in that exact moment. Researchers in this field have found that people trained specifically to expect and manage the psychological effects of isolation, not just the physical survival skills, but the mental ones, consistently make better decisions and survive longer than people with equal physical fitness and equal supplies who haven't been prepared for what isolation actually does. To clear thinking? In other words, the actual determining factor in surviving a week alone usually isn't your strength, your fitness, or even your practical outdoor skills. It's whether you understand, going in, that your own mind is going to actively work against you, and whether you have any kind of plan for that specific problem at all. Search and rescue trainers frequently describe this as the single most counterintuitive lesson they have to teach new volunteers. The person you're searching for is very rarely defeated by the terrain itself. They're defeated by a mind that stopped being able to trust its own judgment somewhere around the second or third day, and started making choices a calmer version of that same person would never have made. Terrain doesn't change its mind about which direction is safe. A frightened, isolated human being does, repeatedly, often within the same single hour. Picture the moment it actually happens. Tallow has fallen behind the rest of the band while tracking an injured animal too far into unfamiliar terrain, and by the time the light starts failing, it's clear nobody is going to reach him again before nightfall. The first few hours are almost purely practical. Finding a defensible spot, building a small fire, rationing the little water he's carrying. It's the second day where something else entirely starts to creep in. There's no one to check his read on a strange sound in the distance. No second set of eyes to confirm whether that shape at the tree line is actually moving, or if his own exhausted mind is simply inventing motion where there isn't any. By the third day, he catches himself narrating his own actions out loud, quietly, to absolutely no one, the same way you caught yourself talking to an empty refrigerator. 2 days into an ordinary weekend, he starts rehearsing conversations with people who aren't there, replaying old arguments, inventing new ones, anything to keep some kind of voice moving through the silence. He isn't in any serious danger from hunger yet, and the water source nearby is more than adequate for his needs. What's actually fraying, hour by hour, is something considerably less visible than either of those things. The steady, load-bearing presence of other minds nearby, minds that would ordinarily confirm what's real, share the weight of a decision, and quietly reassure his nervous system, without either of them ever needing to say a single word about it, that everything happening around him is being witnessed by someone besides himself. When the band finally finds him on the fourth day, thinner, sunburned, but essentially unharmed, the very first thing he does isn't eat, or drink, or rest. It's simply talk. Fast, urgent, almost frantic, as if some part of him needs to confirm, out loud, to another real person, that the last 4 days actually happened at all. The band doesn't rush him. They let him talk, nodding, occasionally answering, understanding without needing it explained that this particular need has to be met first, before food, before rest, before anything else, because they've each felt some smaller version of the exact same pull themselves. On the rare nights the group got separated for even a few hours. Here's the turn, and it's the part that applies directly to how most people in the modern world are actually living right now. For nearly all of human history, isolation like Talos was rare, dangerous, and something every single band member actively worked to avoid and quickly resolve. Today, across many developed countries, the share of people living entirely alone in single-person households has been rising steadily for decades, and remote work, digital entertainment, and food delivery apps mean it's now entirely possible for someone to go an entire week without a single face-to-face conversation by simple accident rather than any deliberate survival emergency at all. Texting, social media, and video calls provide something, certainly, and they're genuinely useful tools. But multiple studies on digital versus in-person connection have found that text-based interaction reliably fails to trigger the same oxytocin release and stress-reducing physiological response that in-person presence and physical proximity do. Your ancient alarm system, the same one that made Tallow start narrating his own actions out loud after 3 days alone in unfamiliar terrain, doesn't fully register a text message, a like, or a video call as the real thing it's actually built to look for. It's still quietly listening for a physical body in the room, a real voice in the same air you're breathing. And a huge, rapidly growing share of the modern world is now unintentionally running the exact same experiment on itself that used to only happen to someone genuinely lost in the wilderness. The difference is that nobody is coming to find you on the fourth day, because from the outside, nothing about this particular kind of isolation looks like an emergency at all. It looks like an ordinary Tuesday, repeated on a loop, for as long as the pattern happens to continue. You assume, if you ever actually had to survive a week completely alone, that the biggest challenge would be finding food, building shelter, staying warm. Tallow found all three of those things within the first few hours, without much difficulty at all, and it barely mattered. What actually wore him down wasn't his stomach, or the cold, or any lack of practical skill. It was the specific, load-bearing absence of another mind nearby to confirm what was real. You go 2 quiet days in your own apartment and catch yourself talking to a refrigerator, half embarrassed by it before you've even finished the sentence. You went 3 days alone in unfamiliar terrain and started rehearsing entire conversations with people who weren't there, for the exact same underlying reason you did. The specific setting is different by tens of thousands of years. The actual mechanism breaking down underneath both of you is exactly the same. One, running on the exact same ancient assumption that you were never, under any circumstances, actually supposed to be doing this entirely by yourself. Tallow had a band that came looking for him on the 4th day. Whether anyone is actually coming to look for you depends entirely on choices you get to make today, long before the silence has any real chance to set in. This has been Foxholes Stories. The next time the silence starts to feel a little too heavy, you'll know exactly which ancient alarm just quietly switched on.